This week's Parsha is Parshat Haazinu, which is the 53rd portion of the Torah and the 10th Parsha in the Book of Devarim, which is the last of the 5 books of Moses. This week's Parsha continues the story of Moses' last day of life. And what's different about Parshat Haazinu is that Moses really is reciting a song to the Jewish people. Rather than typical verses, you can see by the way the Torah is written that this is a little bit different, that this is a song in place of just normal speech or storyline. And the song that Moses recites to the Jewish people has sort of 5 main themes. And I'm going to read you what they are. So the first is essentially that Hashem is the creator of the universe, that Hashem chose the Jews to be his people, and that Hashem is the only constant that we will ever have in our lives. Because Hashem was there, existed, his presence was alive, so to speak, before the world was even created. Hashem was there before the story of Adam and Eve, before the animals, before land, before water, before the skies. There was God. And throughout these thousands of years of history since then, Hashem has still been there. Many things have changed over the course of history, obviously, but one constant has been God's presence. The next idea that Moses gets into is that God gave the land of Israel to us, that God took us out of the land of Egypt, he brought us through the desert for 40 years, and let us arrive in our homeland, in the land of Israel, which is a land that we are still fortunate enough to have to this day. The third concept that Moses talks about is that once the Jewish people were given the land of Israel, they rebelled and were therefore exiled from the land. The temples were destroyed, the Jewish people were further away from God, and we are still exiled to this day, a couple thousand of years later. But the next thing that Moses talks about is that with the coming of the Messiah, with Mashiach's arrival, and the final redemption will begin, and the Jewish people will be restored sort of to our grandeur in the land of Israel, and we'll be able to have a third and final temple. And the last thing that Moses talks about is that once all of these things have occurred, once we have Mashiach and we are restored to our sort of position in the land of Israel, that Hashem will punish our enemies for the way that they treated us for these past thousands of years that the Jewish people were in exile. It's not that God doesn't see the bad that has been done to the Jewish people. God knows, and they will receive the punishment that they deserve when the time comes. The first verse of this song, and I want to read you the words directly, the first verse that sort of Moses says is, "May my teachings drop like the rain, and may my utterances flow like the dew." I heard some really beautiful ideas from My Jewish Learning and Aleph Beta, which are both wonderful Jewish resources, which were talking about this verse and the rain and the dew. And what it was suggesting is that whenever it rains, whether it's a downpour or a drizzle, you're always going to notice it. I mean, how many times would you be outside walking around and something doesn't sort of click in your mind, or someone doesn't say, "Oh, it's raining," whether that be a downpour or a drizzle? You always notice rain, and you always notice that presence of water. But with dew, it sort of just shows up there in the morning. It's not really bothering or disturbing anyone, and so people don't pay much attention to it. And oftentimes, Torah is equated to water, because water is our source of life. We can't go so many days without consuming water, or we'll die. And that, a lot of people believe that's the reason why we read Torah 3 times a week, is because we can't go longer. It's like Torah is a necessity for life too, and so we can't go longer than the span of the three days maybe between Torah reading. Otherwise, it would be sort of like a death for our soul. Just a concept, but Torah and water are often alike to each other. And so when you think again about rain and dew, you could think about rain as being a lot of Torah, or Torah that is obvious maybe. Maybe when you look at rain, again, rain is something obvious. You can't miss rain. And so it's the Torah concepts that are obvious to everybody. Maybe like loving your neighbor, maybe like not stealing, sort of these obvious general concepts that are known to most people, that are sort of common sense. But dew is much more subtle. Dew is something that you have to study if you really want to notice it. And it's kind of the same with Torah as a reference to as like in relation to do is that there are going to be intricacies of the Torah. There are lots of laws that you can study that are very detailed, and that's sort of the difference between rain, which is sort of this overarching concept of quote-unquote water, and dew, which is this more subtle intricacy of Torah. And so I thought that was a really beautiful concept. Both rain and dew, both, obvious Torah and intricate Torah are important, and whichever one you choose to study is great. It's not that one is better than the other. They're both really important and valuable, just like water in any form is valuable as well. The last sort of thing that Moses says in this week's Parsha is something that I also want to read to you directly. He's talking about the Torah, and he says, "It is not an empty thing for you. It is your life." So why would the Torah be likened to our lives? The Torah is likened to our lives, I believe, because the Torah is this guidebook for our life. When you look at the Torah, there's only one Parsha left in the Torah that we haven't read yet. So we've gone through 53 Torah portions before this week, and we have seen stories from the time of creation until now. So much has happened, and really every topic has been discussed. They've talked about marriage, there's been talk about divorce, there's been talk about infertility, there's been conversations about business dealings, what to do with in-laws you don't agree with, or parents you don't agree with, or what do you do with your enemies, and how you have to act during times of war and times of peace. And there has really been every sort of topic that you could imagine has really been discussed so far in the Torah. And so there are examples in the Torah ready to guide us in our own lives now. Everything in the Torah can be adapted to modern lives, even if they don't exactly specifically use the words that are in your situation. You can gain a lot from our forefathers, from our foremothers, and you can sort of like the matriarchs and the patriarchs and all the different stories. There is wisdom to be gained. And so if we look at the Torah as this guidebook for our lives, I think that's really what Moses was intending to say when he said that the Torah is our life. And so I hope each and every one of you can find wisdom and beauty in the Torah, and I wish you all a wonderful week and a Shabbat Shalom.